My son came home alive because of her. The words hit the table harder than a gunshot. My father-in-law slowly lowered his glass onto the picnic table. The faint clink of glass against wood seemed impossibly loud. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the children playing in the yard appeared to fade into the background. My husband's cousin Kevin blinked twice. The grin vanished from his face. "What?" he asked. My father-in-law didn't look away. "I said my son came home alive because of her." Kevin's face turned pale. And for the first time since I'd met him 20 years ago, he had absolutely nothing to say. 3 hours earlier, the barbecue had seemed perfectly ordinary. If anything, I'd almost skipped it. The previous week had been exhausting. After 18 years in aviation management, I'd finally received the promotion I'd spent most of my career working toward: Regional Operations Director. A title that sounded more impressive than it felt. Mostly it meant longer hours, more meetings, and more responsibility. Still, I was proud of it. Not because of the title, because of what it represented. Years of work. Years of sacrifice, years of proving myself. I wasn't looking for praise. I never was. I simply wanted to do my job well. Unfortunately, Kevin had different ideas. The barbecue was being held at my in-laws' house outside Lexington, Kentucky. It was one of those beautiful late summer afternoons. The kind where grandparents sat in lawn chairs. Children chased each other through sprinklers. Country music drifted softly from speakers on the deck. My mother-in-law had enough food to feed a small army. Everything should have been pleasant. For the first hour it was. Then Kevin arrived. Kevin was 50 years old. The kind of man who believed every room needed his opinion, especially when nobody asked for it. He wasn't evil, just exhausting. He had a habit of turning every conversation into a competition. And over the years I'd learned that successful women seemed to bother him more than most things, especially women who worked in traditionally male professions. I was carrying a bowl of potato salad toward the serving table when he spotted me. "There she is." I smiled politely. "Hi, Kevin." He raised a beer. "Congratulations on the promotion." His tone sounded friendly. For about 2 seconds, then came the smirk. The smirk everyone in the family recognized. The one that usually meant trouble. "So tell me." I already knew where this was heading. "Tell you what." "What's it like?" "What's what like?" He took a long sip of beer. "Being management." A few relatives glanced toward us. The conversation was attracting attention. I set the bowl down. "It's a lot of work." Kevin laughed. "Sure," I smiled. "Years ago I would have taken the bait. Not anymore. Experience teaches you some battles aren't worth fighting." Unfortunately, Kevin wasn't finished. He followed me to the drink table, then to the grill, then back to the patio, like a mosquito determined to find exposed skin. Eventually, several family members ended up gathered around us. And Kevin finally reached the point he'd been building toward all afternoon. "So be honest." The conversation around us quieted. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for people to listen. I looked at him. "About what?" His grin widened. "The promotion." A familiar feeling settled in my stomach. I knew exactly what was coming, because it wasn't the first time. Not by a long shot. Kevin leaned back in his chair. "Let's be honest." Nobody spoke. "You only got promoted because you're a woman." Several relatives immediately looked uncomfortable. My mother-in-law closed her eyes. One aunt shook her head. Someone quietly muttered, "Oh boy." Kevin kept going. "They need diversity." A shrug. "Companies love that stuff now." More silence. I stood there calmly. Years earlier, those comments would have hurt. Years earlier, I might have felt compelled to defend myself. Not anymore. The older I got, the less interested I became in proving my worth to people determined not to see it. I reached for a glass of iced tea. Kevin mistook my silence for weakness. They always do. "You know I'm right." A few family members looked embarrassed. Others stared at the table. Nobody wanted the confrontation. But nobody stopped him either. Not yet. I took a slow sip. Then I smiled. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Kevin." Several people laughed. Not loudly, but enough. His face tightened. He hadn't expected that. Kevin preferred reactions. Anger. Frustration. Tears. Anything that made him feel powerful. Calmness ruined the game. His voice sharpened. "So you're saying I'm wrong?" Before I could answer, another voice spoke. A voice deeper than Kevin's. Older. Steadier. The voice of a man who rarely interrupted anyone. My father-in-law, Harold. For 20 years, I'd never once seen him raise his voice. I had never seen him seek attention. When Harold spoke, people listened because he usually waited until he had something worth saying. And right now he was speaking. He slowly placed his glass on the table. The movement was deliberate, measured. The entire family turned toward him. Harold looked directly at Kevin. Then he said, "You're wrong." Kevin blinked. The old man continued, "My son came home alive because of her." The backyard went silent. Completely silent. Kevin's grin disappeared. I felt my heart drop. Because I knew exactly what Harold was talking about. And because I had spent almost 2 decades hoping nobody ever would. Harold's words hung over the backyard like a storm cloud. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. For a few seconds, the only sound came from the distant laughter of children playing near the fence. Kevin looked completely lost. "What are you talking about?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward me. That was what worried me most. Not Kevin. Not the silence. Harold was looking at me as if asking permission. And I already knew what he wanted to say. I shook my head slightly. A silent plea. "Please don't. Not here. Not now." Harold understood. But he also looked tired. Tired of listening to people underestimate me. Tired of hearing the same jokes. Tired of watching me quietly endure them. For years, he'd respected my decision not to discuss the past. Today seemed different. Kevin laughed nervously. "Come on, Uncle Harold." Nobody joined him. His confidence began slipping. The audience he depended on wasn't responding. He glanced around the table. People avoided eye contact. Finally, Harold spoke. "Do you know where Matt and Rachel met?" Kevin shrugged. "Selection." Several relatives nodded. Apparently, most of them believed the same thing. Harold looked almost surprised. "You all thought that—" A few people exchanged awkward looks. My mother-in-law sighed. "We never really asked." Harold nodded slowly. Exactly. That simple word carried more disappointment than anger. For years, everyone had accepted a comfortable version of the story. Matt and Rachel met, got married, built a life. The end. Nobody dug deeper. Nobody asked difficult questions. Most families are like that. We prefer simple stories. Complicated truths require effort. Kevin crossed his arms. "Okay." He laughed again. "But what does any of this have to do with her promotion?" Harold stared at him. "It has everything to do with it." The backyard remained silent. I considered standing up and leaving. Part of me wanted to. The larger part knew it was already too late. The conversation had begun. There was no stopping it now. My husband Matt had been unusually quiet all afternoon. Now he finally spoke. "Maybe we should let it go." Harold looked at his son, then smiled sadly. "I've let it go for 18 years. That caught everyone's attention, including mine." Harold wasn't an emotional man. When someone like him reaches a breaking point, it usually means they've been carrying something for a very long time. Kevin shifted in his chair. The arrogance was fading. Confusion was replacing it. Harold looked around the table. "You know what bothers me?" Nobody answered. He continued anyway. "Every time Rachel succeeds, somebody finds a reason it doesn't count." Silence. "Every promotion. Every achievement. Every accomplishment." His voice remained calm. That somehow made it more powerful. Kevin tried to interrupt. Harold raised a hand. For the first time in 20 years, I watched Kevin stop talking. Completely. Harold continued. "When she finished flight school. When she entered aviation. When she moved into leadership." The old man shook his head. "Somebody always has an excuse." Nobody argued. Because everybody knew he was right. Not just about Kevin. About society. About assumptions. About how often women are expected to prove themselves repeatedly. My aunt finally spoke. "Harold." He looked at her. "Do you remember when Matt got his first promotion?" She nodded. "We celebrated." Harold smiled faintly. "Exactly." Then he looked at me. "And when Rachel got hers?" Nobody answered. Because the answer was sitting right in front of us. An afternoon spent defending it. Kevin shifted again. Now he looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Unfortunately for him, Harold wasn't finished. "Rachel never asks for recognition." He pointed toward me. "Never." The family nodded. That much was undeniably true. I rarely discussed work. Rarely discussed military service. Rarely discussed myself at all. Harold continued. "She spent her entire career letting results speak for themselves." Then he looked directly at Kevin. "And somehow that's still not enough for you." The words landed hard. Kevin opened his mouth. Closed it again. Opened it once more. Nothing came out. For the first time in memory, he genuinely didn't know what to say. Matt quietly reached for my hand under the table. I squeezed it. A simple gesture. But it reminded me why this conversation mattered. Not because of pride. Not because of revenge. Because of truth. Truth has a way of demanding daylight eventually, no matter how long it remains hidden. My mother-in-law finally broke the silence. Harold? Her voice sounded careful. Are you talking about what happened overseas? The entire table turned toward him. My stomach tightened, because now we were getting close. Very close. Harold nodded, slowly. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. Kevin frowned. What happened overseas? Nobody answered, at least not immediately. Matt looked at me. His expression asked the same question Harold's had earlier. Are you okay? I wasn't sure. The memories were old. But old doesn't mean gone. Some things stay with you forever. The smell of fuel, the sound of rotor blades, the feeling of praying a helicopter would hold together just a little longer. I pushed the memories away. Not yet. Harold leaned back in his chair. Then he said something that instantly changed the atmosphere again. 20 years ago, my son was supposed to die. The backyard fell completely silent. Even Kevin looked stunned. Nobody had expected that sentence. Nobody. And the worst part, Harold wasn't exaggerating. 20 years ago, my son was supposed to die. The words settled over the table like a heavy fog. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Kevin seemed unable to process what he'd just heard. Matt stared at his father. Not because he disagreed, because he knew Harold was telling the truth. My father-in-law slowly folded his hands together. For a moment, he looked much older than his 72 years. Age has a way of revealing itself when old wounds reopen. Matt was 23, Harold said quietly. He'd been overseas less than 8 months. My mother-in-law looked down. I could see tears already forming in her eyes. She remembered every day of that deployment. Every phone call. Every sleepless night. Every moment spent waiting for news, Harold continued. Then one afternoon we got the call. Nobody interrupted. You don't interrupt someone talking about the worst day of their life. The army told us he'd been critically wounded. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard Harold tell this story before. Not once. Not in 20 years. Not ever. The family sat completely still. Kevin's face had gone pale. Harold wasn't looking at him anymore. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was staring somewhere far beyond the backyard. Back into memories. Back into fear. Back into uncertainty. The doctors didn't know if he'd survive. The silence deepened. A breeze moved through the trees. Nobody seemed to notice. Harold took a slow breath. They told us to prepare for the worst. My mother-in-law quietly wiped her eyes. I reached over and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. For years we'd avoided discussing those days. Some pain never completely disappears. You simply learn to carry it. Kevin finally spoke. His voice sounded smaller now. What happened? Harold looked at him, then at me, then back at Kevin. What happened, he said, is that somebody refused to quit. My stomach dropped. Because now we were entering territory I'd spent 2 decades avoiding. Matt spoke softly. Dad, Harold looked at him. I know. But he continued anyway. The weather was terrible. Several relatives looked confused. Harold noticed. You think helicopters can fly anywhere? A faint smile crossed his face. Movies teach people that. A few nervous laughs escaped. Then the smile disappeared. Reality is different. Everyone listened. The mission should have been canceled. My heart started beating faster. Because I remembered. God, I remembered. Every detail. Every second. Every terrible decision. Harold wasn't telling a story. He was reopening a chapter I'd spent years trying to close. My aunt frowned. Who told you all this? Harold smiled sadly. After Matt recovered, I asked questions. A pause. I wanted to know why my son was still alive. Nobody spoke. Because everybody understood. Any parent would have done the same, Harold continued. The answers kept leading back to one person. I looked away. Not because I was embarrassed. Because I knew where this was heading. Matt squeezed my hand again. Harold pointed toward me. Rachel. The family collectively turned. I wished they wouldn't. I hated being the center of attention. Always had. Kevin stared at me, then laughed nervously. Wait, nobody responded. His voice became weaker. Wait a second. Harold remained calm. Kevin looked at me, then back at Harold, then back at me again. You were there? Nobody answered. Not immediately. The silence itself became an answer. My husband finally spoke. Yes. One word. That's all it took. Kevin blinked repeatedly. The confidence was gone now. Completely gone. What do you mean she was there? Matt leaned back. For several seconds, he simply stared toward the lake. The expression on his face was distant. The same expression veterans get when they're looking at something nobody else can see. Finally, he spoke. I don't remember much. The table remained silent. I remember the explosion. A few relatives visibly flinched. Matt continued. I remember waking up on the ground. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the effort behind it. I remember people yelling. A pause. I remember thinking I wasn't going home. Nobody moved. Not even Kevin. Especially not Kevin. Matt looked toward me, then smiled softly. I was wrong. The backyard remained completely silent, because everyone knew what he was saying, without saying it. Harold nodded. The rescue helicopter arrived. My stomach tightened again. The memories were becoming harder to ignore. Rotor blades. Dust. Radio calls. Fear. Harold continued. Most people would have turned around. Matt nodded. Probably. The old man looked at the family. But somebody didn't. Nobody spoke. Because suddenly the story wasn't about promotions anymore, or workplace politics, or family arguments. It was about life, death, choices, consequences. Kevin looked like he wanted to disappear. The problem was that the truth was still only beginning, because nobody at that table knew what had actually happened that day. Nobody knew how bad the conditions were. Nobody knew how close we came to crashing. Nobody knew how many wounded soldiers were waiting. And nobody knew why I had never told the story. Harold looked directly at Kevin, then said quietly, You think Rachel got promoted because she's a woman? A pause. I think Rachel gets promoted because she runs toward problems while other people look for excuses. The words landed like a hammer. Kevin lowered his eyes. For the first time all afternoon, nobody felt sorry for him. Not even himself. And then Harold said something that made the entire family lean forward. Let me tell you what happened that day. The backyard disappeared. At least that's how it felt. One moment I was sitting at a family barbecue. The next I was 21 years old again, back inside a military helicopter, listening to rotor blades hammer through the darkness, listening to a radio operator trying not to sound scared, listening to weather warnings nobody wanted to hear. Harold took a slow breath. Then he began. The mission happened in late fall. Nobody interrupted. It was supposed to be a routine medical evacuation. I closed my eyes briefly. Routine. Veterans always laugh at that word. There is no such thing as a routine mission in a combat zone. Not really, Harold continued. The weather changed. Matt nodded. Fast. The family listened carefully. Most had never heard military stories from someone they actually knew. Movies are one thing. Reality feels different. Harold looked toward me. You were 21, right? I nodded. 21? A few relatives looked surprised. Kevin looked shocked. He'd probably imagined I was some seasoned veteran at the time. The truth was much less impressive. I was young, far too young, and terrified more often than I'd ever admitted. Harold continued. The rescue request came in, Matt quietly added. Several wounded. I swallowed. More than several. Some of those young men were barely older than I was. Some were younger. The radio reports kept getting worse. Every update sounded more urgent. Every update sounded more desperate. Harold looked around the table. The weather was bad enough that several pilots didn't want to fly. Kevin frowned. Didn't want to. I finally spoke. The first time I'd truly joined the conversation. It wasn't about courage. Everyone looked at me. It was about probability. Silence. I continued. Pilots calculate risk. Nobody interrupted. We're trained to. The memories became sharper. The weather reports. The terrain. The visibility. The fuel calculations. Everything. We knew the mission was dangerous. My mother-in-law squeezed my hand. I smiled faintly, then continued. We also knew people were waiting. Nobody spoke, because there wasn't much more to say. People were wounded. People needed help. Everything else came second. Harold nodded. She volunteered. I immediately shook my head. Not exactly. The family looked confused. I smiled sadly. Nobody volunteered. Several relatives frowned. I explained. You don't raise your hand and become a hero. A few quiet laughs. I continued. You look at the mission. You look at the risks. You make a decision. The backyard remained silent. Then I said the simplest truth. I couldn't leave them there. Nobody spoke, because nobody could argue with that. Harold continued the story. The helicopter took off. The memories flooded back completely now. Dark mountains, heavy clouds, rain, radio static, a cockpit illuminated by green instruments, and fear. So much fear. People who have never flown in combat imagine confidence. Movies teach them that. Real pilots aren't confident. They're focused. There's a difference. I remembered gripping the controls, remembered checking instruments repeatedly, remembered hoping I wasn't making a fatal mistake. Harold continued. The flight became worse. Matt nodded. Much worse. The old man looked at Kevin. Visibility almost disappeared. Kevin sat quietly. The arrogant cousin from earlier was gone, replaced by someone listening. Actually listening. For once, Harold continued. When they reached the landing zone, things got even worse. I exhaled slowly. The landing zone. I still dreamed about it occasionally. Not nightmares anymore. Just memories. The place was chaos. Wounded soldiers. Medics. Dust. Confusion. Fear. Everyone trying to stay alive. Everyone trying to help someone else stay alive. Harold looked toward me, then stopped talking. He didn't know the rest. Not really. Nobody did, because I'd never told them. And suddenly I realized if the story was going to be told, it needed to come from me. The family looked in my direction, waiting. I hated that feeling. Always had. But after 20 years, maybe it was time. I set down my glass, then spoke. When we landed, I saw the stretchers. Nobody moved. There were more wounded than expected. My voice remained calm. Experience teaches you how to discuss difficult memories without falling apart. Usually, we loaded everyone we could. Silence. We were overweight. Several relatives looked confused. I explained. The helicopter wasn't supposed to carry that many people. A pause. But nobody was getting left behind. Matt looked down. He already knew this part. I'd told him years ago. Only him. The family listened. I continued. We took off. The memory remained crystal clear. Every second, every vibration, every warning light, every prayer. We barely cleared the terrain. Nobody spoke. The backyard felt frozen. Then my father-in-law quietly asked, "Were you scared?" The question surprised me. Not because of the answer, because of how gently he asked it. I smiled. The same answer I'd given years earlier to another veteran. Terrified. Several relatives blinked. The honesty caught them off guard. People expect courage to look fearless. It doesn't. The truth is usually the opposite. I looked around the table, then said, "The brave people are almost always scared." Nobody argued, because everybody understood. Even if they'd never worn a uniform, even if they'd never flown a helicopter, fear is universal. The choice to move forward anyway is what matters. The backyard remained silent. Then Matt spoke. His voice was soft, almost emotional. The doctors told me later that I should have died before reaching the hospital. Nobody moved. Not even Kevin. Matt looked directly at his cousin, then said, "But I didn't." The words hung there, simple, powerful, undeniable. And for the first time all afternoon, Kevin looked like a man beginning to understand the size of the mistake he'd made. Matt's words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. But I didn't. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Nobody could. The statement carried too much weight. My husband wasn't a dramatic man. Never had been. He worked as a project manager for a construction company now. Spent weekends fixing things around the house. Forgot where he left his reading glasses at least twice a week. To most people, he looked like an ordinary middle-aged American husband. Because that's exactly what he was. The problem was that everyone at the table suddenly understood how close he had come to never becoming any of those things. Never becoming a husband. Never becoming a father. Never becoming a son who came home. My mother-in-law quietly wiped her eyes. Harold reached over and took her hand. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some memories belong to both parents, especially memories involving almost losing a child. Kevin stared down at his beer. For once he wasn't searching for a comeback. The old confidence had completely disappeared. The family remained quiet. Then my aunt asked the question everyone was thinking. Why didn't we know any of this? I smiled sadly. Because that question had a very simple answer. Because I didn't tell anyone. Several relatives looked confused. My cousin Sarah frowned. But why? I leaned back in my chair. The afternoon sun reflected across the lake behind us. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Life continued normally while old memories sat heavily around the picnic table. I looked at Sarah, then at everyone else. Because it wasn't my story. The family exchanged confused looks, I continued. At least not entirely. Nobody interrupted. People hear about military rescues and imagine one person doing something heroic. I shook my head. That's not how it works. Harold nodded immediately. He understood. Matt did too. The rest of the family listened. There were mechanics who kept the aircraft flying. Medics treating wounded soldiers. Crew chiefs watching for threats. Doctors waiting at the hospital. I paused. Nobody succeeds alone. The table remained silent. I continued. If I tell the story like it's about me, then I'm ignoring everybody else who made it possible. Several relatives nodded. For the first time, they were seeing a side of military service that movies rarely show. The teamwork, the dependence, the reality. Kevin finally spoke. His voice sounded smaller than ever. But you still did it. I looked at him, then smiled gently. No. The answer surprised him. I could see it. No, Kevin. I pointed toward Matt. We did it. Then toward Harold and my mother-in-law. You did it. The family looked confused again, I explained. Because when somebody serves, everybody sacrifices. The backyard grew quiet. I looked toward my mother-in-law. You spent months wondering if your son would come home. She nodded. Tears filled her eyes. I looked toward Harold. You carried that too. He nodded. I continued. The families serve in their own way. Nobody spoke. Because they understood. Perhaps for the first time. Military service isn't experienced only by the person wearing the uniform. It ripples outward. Parents, spouses, children. Everybody carries part of the burden. Kevin looked uncomfortable, not defensive, ashamed. A completely different emotion. The change was obvious. Harold noticed it too. The old man leaned back, then smiled. I've been waiting 20 years to hear somebody say that. A few relatives laughed softly. The tension eased slightly. Then my younger nephew asked a question. Kids have a way of cutting directly to the heart of things. Were you a hero? The adult smiled. I laughed. No. Why not? The question was sincere. I looked at him. Because heroes don't get scared. Several adults exchanged looks. I continued. And I was scared all the time. That earned a few chuckles. But I wasn't joking. The truth matters. Especially to children. I didn't want him growing up believing courage meant fearlessness. That's a dangerous lie. Courage means doing the right thing even when you're afraid. He thought about that, then nodded seriously, apparently satisfied. The adult smiled, but Kevin looked thoughtful, very thoughtful, as if something important was finally connecting. A realization, a lesson, maybe even regret. Then Matt surprised everyone, including me. He stood, cleared his throat, and looked directly at his cousin. There's one thing nobody here knows. The backyard immediately became quiet again. I frowned. What was he doing? Matt smiled slightly, then looked around the table. When I woke up in the hospital, I didn't know who Rachel was. Several relatives laughed softly. That wasn't surprising. What came next was, I spent months trying to find the pilot who saved my life. The laughter disappeared. The family listened carefully. Matt continued. I wasn't looking for a girlfriend. A few smiles. I wasn't looking for a relationship. More smiles. I just wanted to say thank you. I felt my face warm slightly. Even after 20 years, some stories still embarrassed me. Matt continued. It took almost a year. The family listened. When I finally met her, he smiled at me. She acted like it wasn't a big deal. Several relatives laughed. Because that sounded exactly like me. Matt nodded. That's when I knew she was different. The family remained silent. Then he added one final sentence. A sentence that left everyone speechless. Especially Kevin. She saved my life. A pause. Then she spent years pretending it wasn't important. Nobody spoke. Because suddenly my promotion wasn't the story anymore. Neither was the rescue mission. Neither was the argument. The real story was character. And everybody at that table finally understood it. The barbecue ended an hour later. Nobody wanted to be the first person to leave. At the same time, nobody quite knew what to say. The conversation had become something none of us expected. What started as a cheap insult had turned into a family reckoning. People lingered, helped clean up, talked quietly in small groups. For the first time in years, nobody was arguing. Nobody was competing. Nobody was trying to be the loudest voice in the yard. Even Kevin, especially Kevin. I noticed him standing alone near the lake, staring across the water, thinking, actually thinking. That alone was unusual. As the sun began to set, Matt and I helped Harold carry folding chairs into the garage. The old man moved slower these days. Age was beginning to catch up with him. Not that he'd ever admit it. Halfway through carrying a chair, he stopped, looked at me, and smiled. I probably shouldn't have said all that. I laughed. Probably not, Harold chuckled. Sorry. No, you're not. That made him laugh harder. No, he wasn't sorry. Not really. For 20 years he'd watched people underestimate me. Today he'd finally reached his limit. I understood, maybe better than anyone. When we finished cleaning up, he sat on a workbench, then motioned for me to sit beside him. For a moment neither of us spoke. The garage felt peaceful, quiet, a welcome contrast to the emotional afternoon. Finally, Harold broke the silence. "You know what bothers me most?" I looked at him. "What?" "The promotion wasn't enough." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "You earned something important." I remained silent. "You worked for years. You succeeded. You should have been able to enjoy it." A pause. "Instead, you had to defend it." The truth hit harder than I expected. Because he was right. The entire family gathering should have been celebrating good news. Instead, we'd spent the afternoon discussing whether I deserved it. Harold continued. "People always want women to prove one thing more." I smiled faintly. "Only one." That earned a laugh. Then he grew serious again. "You know what I mean?" I did. "Most women do. You learn early. You work harder, achieve more. Then somebody insists there must be another explanation. Luck, politics, quotas, anything except competence." Harold shook his head. "Drives me crazy." I smiled. "You're a little late getting angry about it." The old man laughed. "Fair." Then he looked toward the garage door, toward the lake, toward the fading sunlight, and said something I would never forget. "Respect should never need witnesses." The sentence stayed with me. Not because it was clever, because it was true. Real respect isn't something people suddenly discover after hearing a dramatic story. It should exist before the story, before the proof, before the explanation. That's the whole point. A few minutes later, someone knocked lightly on the open garage door. Kevin. Harold immediately stood, without a word, without being asked. He simply left, giving us privacy. That small act told me everything. The conversation ahead belonged to us, nobody else. Kevin stepped inside, then stopped. For once he seemed unsure of himself. The man who always had an opinion suddenly looked like a teenager facing a principal. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he took a breath. "I owe you an apology." There it was. The sentence everyone expected. The sentence he'd probably rehearsed a dozen times. I nodded, but didn't rescue him. Some things need to be said completely. Kevin looked down, then back up. "I was wrong." A pause. "About the promotion." Another pause. "About a lot of things." The garage remained quiet. I listened. Nothing more. Nothing less. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. I kept telling myself it was about fairness. I waited. It wasn't. The honesty surprised me. He laughed bitterly. I think I was jealous. I blinked. The same word. The same admission. The exact thing people rarely say aloud. Kevin continued. "You worked for everything." His voice cracked slightly. "I spent years making excuses." The garage fell silent again, because deep down he already knew the truth. This had never been about me. Not really. It was about him. His disappointments. His frustrations. His choices. People sometimes attack what they secretly admire. Not because they hate it, because it reminds them of what they failed to become. Kevin looked at me. "I kept trying to make your accomplishments smaller." I nodded. "Yes." The honesty startled him. Then he laughed. I deserved that. For the first time all evening, we both smiled. The tension eased. Not gone, but easing. Kevin took a deep breath, then asked the question that mattered. "Can you forgive me?" The garage became very quiet. I thought about every joke, every comment, every family gathering, every time I'd chosen silence. Then I thought about something else. The lesson hidden underneath all of it. Resentment is heavy, and I was tired of carrying it. Very tired. So I smiled, and gave him the answer neither of us expected when the day began. I smiled. "Yes." Kevin stared at me. For a second, I don't think he believed he'd heard correctly. Then his shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to tell me he'd been carrying tension for a very long time. The kind of tension people create for themselves. The kind that grows when guilt sits unresolved. He laughed softly, almost in disbelief. "Really?" I nodded. "Really?" The garage fell quiet. A few moments later, Kevin wiped at his eyes and immediately pretended he wasn't. I pretended not to notice. Some kindness is best left unspoken. Eventually he smiled. A genuine smile. One I hadn't seen from him in years. Maybe decades. Then he left. And just like that, the longest argument in our family quietly ended. Not with shouting. Not with humiliation. Not with revenge. With honesty. Funny how life works sometimes. The following months felt different. Not perfect. Different. Family gatherings became easier. Conversations became lighter. People listened more. Assumed less. And perhaps most surprising of all, Kevin changed. Not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. But steadily. Consistently. He stopped turning every discussion into a competition. He asked questions instead of delivering opinions. He listened. Sometimes that's the biggest transformation of all. A few months after the barbecue, Thanksgiving arrived. The entire family gathered again. Same backyard. Same house. Same folding tables. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different. The tension was gone. The old patterns were gone too. At one point I was helping my mother-in-law bring food outside when she touched my arm. "You know," she said quietly, "Harold's been happier lately." I smiled. "He has," she nodded. "He worried about you." That surprised me. Not because Harold cared. Because he'd never said it. My mother-in-law laughed. "That's how he shows love." Fair enough. That sounded exactly like Harold. When we reached the patio, I saw him sitting with several younger relatives, including my teenage niece. She was asking questions about careers, college, life, the future, the kinds of questions young people ask when they're trying to figure out who they want to become. As I approached, I heard Harold say something that made me stop. "Don't let anybody tell you what you can or can't do." My niece nodded. Harold pointed toward me, especially if they've never done it themselves. Several people laughed, including me. Harold grinned, then returned to his pie. Conversation continued. Children played football in the yard. Grandparents shared stories. The afternoon drifted along peacefully. Exactly the way family gatherings are supposed to. At one point, Kevin walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me. "Peace offering." I accepted. "You're about 4 months late." He laughed. Story of my life. Then he grew serious. Not heavy, just thoughtful. "You know something?" "What?" "I used to think respect came from being the smartest person in the room." I took a sip of coffee. "And now," he looked around the yard, at family, at children, at people laughing together. "Now I think it comes from making other people feel valued." I smiled. "That's a much harder skill." "Yeah." A pause. "Still working on it, aren't we all?" The afternoon continued. As the sun began to set, Harold slowly stood. His knees complained about it, loudly. Everyone laughed, including him. He raised his glass, not dramatically, just enough to get attention. The family quieted. Harold looked around the yard, at his wife, at his son, at me, at Kevin, at the grandchildren running through the grass. Then he spoke. "You know what I've learned?" Nobody answered. They didn't need to. Harold smiled. "We spend too much time judging chapters when we haven't read the whole book." Silence. "The good kind. The thoughtful kind." He continued. "Most people are carrying battles we know nothing about." Heads nodded around the yard, including mine, especially mine. Harold raised his glass slightly. "So maybe we should be slower to judge." A pause. "And quicker to listen." Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. The message landed exactly where it needed to. As I watched my family that evening, I realized something. The promotion had never been the real victory. Neither was proving Kevin wrong. Neither was finally receiving recognition. The real victory was something much quieter. Understanding. Forgiveness. Perspective. The things that actually last. Titles come and go. Careers end. Awards gather dust. But character remains. That's what people remember. That's what matters. And if there was one lesson hidden inside this entire story, it was this. Never assume someone's success was handed to them. You rarely see the sacrifices. You rarely see the setbacks. You rarely see the years of effort that happened long before the reward arrived. Everyone has a story. Most people simply don't tell it. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment to appreciate them. And if you've ever been underestimated, judged unfairly, or forced to prove yourself again and again, remember this. You don't owe everyone an explanation. Sometimes the strongest response is simply continuing forward. If you enjoyed this story, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. And if stories about family resilience, forgiveness, and quiet strength speak to you, we'd love to have you join us for the next one. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.